Hello, this is Mick Sullivan from the Fraser History Museum's Kentucky-wide podcast. And while we work on a new season, we wanted to share a few favorite other Kentucky podcasters. And many of us have been fans of Jameson Cable's Kentucky History podcast for years now. He's got a great collection of shows, an inspiring passion, and a dedication to something we all care about, the history of our Commonwealth. So, while you wait for our next season, enjoy this, and be sure to subscribe to Kentucky History Podcast.
Hello everyone, my name is Jameson Cable and I host the Kentucky History Podcast, a show that is dedicated to exploring Kentucky's rich and complex history. I'm thrilled to be collaborating with our friends, Kentucky-wide podcast produced by the Fraser Kentucky History Museum for this special feed swap. The episode you're about to hear is one of our most popular shows, Shawnee in Kentucky. It features a conversation with Dr. Stephen Warren, a leading scholar in Shawnee history and culture. Together we discuss the Shawnee people's deep connection to Kentucky, their interactions with national governments, and the ways they preserved their identity through times of conflict and migration. This is a story that not only gives us a better understanding of Kentucky's past, but also helps us think about history's relevance today. I'm honored to share it with you. If you enjoy this episode, you can find more conversations like it by searching the Kentucky History Podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or by visiting our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Kentucky History Channel. And of course, you can learn more about Dr. Warren's work, including his book, The Worlds the Shawnees Made, Migration and Violence in Early America, with the links in the show notes. Thanks again to the Kentucky-wide podcast for partnering with us on this project. And now, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we got a great topic here to talk about today. And joining me is Dr. Stephen Warren. He's a professor at the University of Iowa. He's the professor of history and program coordinator of Native American Indigenous Studies. He's written multiple books about the Shawnee, and that's going to be our topic today. But thank you for joining us, Dr. Warren. How you doing?
Thank you. Thanks for asking me, Jameson.
Well, first off, let's just start off with your connection to Kentucky and so forth, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, one of my favorite places on the planet is Berea, Kentucky, and I used to teach at Eastern Kentucky University, and climbed the mountains of the county there, and really enjoyed my time. So I miss Kentucky. It's a beautiful state.
Well, of course, probably most people listening to the podcast and myself are a little biased about how awesome it is, but it's good to get a reassuring approval.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the Shawnee tribe today,
Sure.
and multiple aspects of it, and we'll just go through as much as we can. But
Sure.
We've been talking a lot on the podcast about the frontiersmen and
Sure.
that side of things, but we're going to kind of switch over because there's more to the story, as in all of history, we kind of want to give the Shawnee their due as well, and talk a little bit about them.
Sure.
So, as a whole, I mean, you've spent many years looking into the Shawnee. What sets them aside that's different from, say, other tribes?
Well, that's a big question, and hard to break down. But I thought that something that I would like to do is maybe start with the present day. Mm-hmm. So there are 3 federally recognized Shawnee tribes in the United States. Now, the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, the Absentee Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and the Shawnee Tribe. And so all 3 of those nations were removed to what is now Oklahoma. And so their homeland is Kentucky and Ohio, but that's where they are now. What's somewhat distinctive about the Shawnee is that their name for themselves, the Shawnee, means Southerners in Central Algonquian, and so they're one of the southernmost, or the southernmost Algonquian, Central Algonquian speakers. And so their homeland truly is, Ohio and Kentucky. And another characteristic of their people is that they've always had a kind of a diffident relationship to nationalism. And so most Shawnee people lived in fairly autonomous villages in the time period we're talking about, in the 17th century, 16th century, 18th century. And so, they didn't have kind of a unified leadership structure or national government modeled after the United States. And you can see that in evidence today in Oklahoma with the three distinct nations. There are other Native nations that consolidated as a nation much more smoothly and quickly than did the Shawnee.
That is a loaded question, huh?
Yeah.
That is a lot.
And something that is the central myth about Kentucky is that there were no native villages there. And so I'd kind of like to talk about that because I've done a lot of research mapping Shawnee villages, and in fact there were many villages both in the pre-contact period and in the historic period, and one of the reasons why the Shawnees fought so desperately for Kentucky in the era of Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton and all those folks that you talked about is because of their economy.
Yeah.
And so, I was thinking today, as I was getting ready for this podcast, that, if we just decided tomorrow that, it was okay to hunt Canadian geese, there wouldn't be any Canadian geese like in a month, they'd all be gone, Same with deer. I was in Bloomington, Indiana the other day, and I was walking down the middle of that town, right in the center of it. And there was a deer walking down the street.
Yeah. Well,
so today, there are these animals in our lives that are super abundant, but most Americans don't hunt.
Yeah.
And Kentuckians and Shawnees, they hunted, for their survival. And just having the settlers come into Kentucky had an enormous impact on the availability of game because everyone was surviving on wild animals.
Yeah.
And so the carrying capacity of the land wasn't sufficient north of the Ohio River to maintain the Shawnee people.
Yeah.
They had to have their hunting ground in Kentucky. And the way people lived back then is they had big summer villages where they planted corn and beans and squash. But then in October, from roughly October to March, they dispersed. And they were often 200 miles, 300 miles from that summer villages, from that summer village. And so, it's much harder to find archaeologically a winter hunting camp than it is a summer village.
Yeah.
With 500 people, 1,000 people. You can see that archaeologically. It's very hard to see 15 to 30 people in a winter hunting camp in Kentucky. We know a few of them, but not many. The footprint is a lot diminished. So that's what people were fighting over. They were fighting over their normal range of hunting, fishing, and gathering necessary for them to survive.
Now, the disbursement or the dividing into the winter hunting camps and stuff, was that just solely so it would be less people trying to survive off of less food, or what was the do you think there's
Yeah, that's a good
reason for
question.
that?
Yeah, I think it has to do with, again, the economy, right? So
Mhm.
like in the summer, from the spring to the summer, um, you could survive mainly on agricultural products and on salted meat. But if people stayed in that summer village year round, they would exhaust the ability to survive on wild animals. And so again, it's about the carrying capacity.
Mhm.
It's about allowing people or allowing animals in the summer village area to recuperate,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And and so you have to kind of understand the carrying capacity of animals to keep the stock alive, to keep everything in balance, and so people learned, how to kind of live, um, I guess, in concert with the land and the animals.
Yeah, that's very smart. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
it is
it
smart.
is to let nature kind of replenish itself,
Yes.
and so forth. And that's one thing as I've dealt more into the history, the common misconception is that no native tribes. It was just this peaceful, no, they just
Yeah.
hunted here and all that kind of stuff. But over time, logically, that just, it doesn't make as much sense to me as
Yeah.
it's perceived to be because like w- they're not, they're not nomadic in the sense that they just constantly roam, but they don't stay in the same villages. It wouldn't make sense that they would
Mhm.
not get closer to their resources and get
Right.
inside the state lines of Kentucky,
That's right.
um, and when you look at the maps and stuff, old maps and stuff, it just doesn't add up. I guess to me, logically, I don't see why they wouldn't be in here living and stuff if they were already
Yeah.
using the resources. Um,
Well, you sort of have to ask yourself, why would so many Shawnees fight and die for Kentucky?
mhm. Yeah, yeah,
If it wasn't important to them,
yeah.
it's just logically, he just wouldn't do it. And
Yeah.
so their understanding of what was at stake,
Mhm.
was pretty different.
Well, yeah, and to add on to that point, there's a reason there was no Navajo or Dakota who died fighting for Kentucky because they
It's not
didn't
their
need it.
land.
They didn't use it.
Right.
They didn't, you know, um,
That's
yeah,
right.
that makes sense.
That's right.
Well, and I'll let you talk. Let's talk about your books here real quick too, because you got multiple ones. And I'm gonna be the I don't know. Make you choose. Which one was your favorite book? Which one?
Oh, gosh.
Which one do you?
Well, I want
Uh,
to talk about
yeah.
because I'm on the Kentucky History
Mhm.
podcast. I think it'd be a good idea to talk about the Worlds the Shawnees Made because
Yeah.
one of the things that I wrote that book
Mhm.
to explain the fact that the Fort Ancient people,
Mhm.
who have a deep archaeological signature in Kentucky, are the ancestors of the modern Shawnee tribes.
Okay.
Not exclusively.
Yeah.
There are other native nations that were part of the Fort Ancient world,
Mhm.
but the archaeological record confirms that these were Shawnee people.
Mhm.
And so, if we take a longer view of Native American history and we start it in, say, 1400
Mhm.
rather than 1768,
Yeah.
or 1790, then we can start to see really profound connections between the modern Shawnee people and their archaeological ancestors.
Mhm.
And so, that's what that book was about. And I feel like I proved it. I mean, no one else has come on me and said, hey, you're full of it yet. But I'm sure they will after listening to this podcast. But but the problem with disconnecting modern tribes from archaeologically known communities is that it divorces Native Americans from their deep history and their deep connection to the land.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that has all sorts of repercussions for Native Americans today. So if you're a Native American and you're a Shawnee today, before I wrote my book, people were arguing, that look, they just emerged out of the ether. We don't know, where they came from. We don't know who their people were. Literally, Shawnee history began with Daniel Boone.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of messed up.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I wrote a book about it.
well, that's good. That's good.
I mean, they didn't come down in a spaceship.
Yeah.
They came from somewhere, and that somewhere is Kentucky and Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Because and correct me if I'm wrong, because I very well may be. Because I read, and this is probably not the best source and stuff as either, but popular to Frontiers Kentucky. You got Alan Eckert, who wrote The Frontiersman, and you got Sorrow in Our Heart, that's focused on Tecumseh and so forth. How accurate are those books?
Well, I don't like to. Those books are really cherished by many people in Kentucky,
and they're great to read. Like, they're very entertaining to read and good. I take it as in, I feel like he takes some liberties, because there's not, there's not really this documentation of these tribal meetings as much as people want to think there is, I guess. But and is it I guess that's my best thought, is that there's some liberties taken that probably aren't there, as far as events and stuff.
I mean, so I read historical fiction. I'm an avid reader, and I read novels, I read historical fiction, and I read history books. And I guess for the audience out there, what I would say is it's important to know that people like Alan Eckert and James Alexander Thom write historical fiction. So they aren't beholden to the historical and archaeological record the way that I am. In the Worlds the Shawnees Made and these other books, I'm only allowed to say or to write what is provable in the archaeological record, whereas folks like Eckert and Thom, they can create whole scenes, that are imagined. And that's just a boundary that I can't cross as a practicing historian. So I would just encourage folks, to explore what historians have written, because there's a lot of good work out there.
Plenty. And I guess it's my thing, and I love The Frontiersman. It's a great book. I love reading it. I've read it multiple times. But having that thought, because in reading that book, it led me to reading the one about Tecumseh, and this has led me down the more of the rabbit hole of the Shawnee and what they had and what they did, and as far as Kentucky goes, and I bring that up because it seems like in some of those books as well, the Shawnee really cherished Kentucky and their land. This was their inherited land that had belonged to them. I can't think of the was it the great father or that promised them that. It's been a little bit.
Yeah, I would just encourage you to read beyond that. Contrary to popular opinion, some history books, history monographs are actually well written and enjoyable to read. I'm not saying mine are, but I'm just saying I hope that a lot of folks push beyond historical fiction. So that people get a more accurate rendering, and something that that Eckert and James Alexander Thom and those other folks do, is they have a tendency to focus their stories around very specific men, right? So they tell the Tecumseh story, the Blue Jacket story. They tell the corn planter story or the cornstalk story, and it's almost as if you're imagining Shawnee people without women and children.
Yeah.
And that and it leads you to believe that the Shawnee people did nothing else but fight.
Right. Yeah.
That they were just warriors. And something that is super important for folks to come away with is that the Shawnee they still do. They had a divided polity.
Mm-hmm.
And so they do have patrilineal descent, but they divide the leadership of their community between women and men.
Mm-hmm.
So women are in charge in the spring and summer, and men are in charge in the fall and winter.
Wow.
And so literally half of the year they have a female chief who calls the shots about where to plant, when the ceremonies are going to go down. And Shawnee people, believe that plants like corn are feminine and that they should only be handled by women.
Wow.
And so the women were the agriculturalists. And so, that's my problem with Eckert and Tom and those folks is like,
Yeah, well, that's true.
Like most of the time, people were living.
Yeah.
And running their lives as we all do, and women had enormous authority, but we settler historians have a tendency to not write about that.
Yeah.
See what I mean?
Yeah. And which that I guess brings us into a good point to talk about the culture and stuff, how the culture was a bit different. And I'll ask this question again. Well, Shawnee culture versus other tribes. I mean, anything that's completely different or similarities and so forth?
Well, the big distinction, between the Shawnee and their neighbors is that the Shawnees moved at a greater distance as a result of colonialism than any other community I know of. And
Wow.
so if you think about colonialism, when it starts, which for Native North Americans is in 1540 or 1539 with their Hernando de Soto expedition. He travels through the southeast, and that creates all sorts of repercussions. It introduces violence on a scale never seen before. It introduces domesticated animals. It introduces virgin soil diseases. And so right about 1540, you see this massive diaspora out of Kentucky and Ohio. And you have Shawnee villages emerging in what is now Augusta, Georgia. You have Shawnee villages emerging in Alabama. Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, that's a big story. And what's fascinating to me about it is when the Shawnee people were part of the Fort Ancient world, they were basically sedentary agriculturalists. So they were farmers.
Yeah.
And they dispersed to, their winter hunting camps, but they were never that far from their home. And then suddenly, as a result of colonization, people are moving, 500, 600, 700, 800 miles away from their homes.
Yeah. Wow. Now, and a few things that the DeSoto, now, to my understanding, he came up to about South Carolina, North Carolina, and then came west, and then came up through, say, Tennessee and Kentucky, and then back down to Mississippi. He died, towards the end of the Mississippi, I believe, right, or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that,
1541 or something like that. Yeah, is when he finally vanished from the scene. So go ahead.
Well, and out of all the, he was probably, I don't know. The things I've read about him is not too positive.
No, not too flattering. No, no.
Make
Taking people hostage, you know, he just was accustomed to intimidation.
Yeah, and
rule by force.
Yeah. But then the other question, or the thing I said, you mentioned this before, and you've used this term, and the four, what's the term you're saying? The tribes of four, the
the Fort Ancient people.
Fort Ancient people. Is that what is that?
Fort is F-O-R-T. Yeah, Fort Ancient. Yeah. That's the name given to the latest archaeological group or culture that inhabited Kentucky and Ohio.
Okay.
And parts of Indiana. Actually.
Okay, so the Fort Ancient people.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, well, and I bring that up too. I know I was in Montgomery County, Kentucky a while back, and they always call it the Andes Mounds or whatever. Some people call it that, and that's not that's not the name. That's not the name. I think if I'm correct, that the person who discovered it wasn't that. That's not the name of the people that were living here. It's just,
No, in fact, all of those names for mounds and Fort Ancient, those are all inventions of the archaeological people, or of the archaeologists, who initially dug those mounds. So they have no connection to native names.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. So I mean, 1500s, that sort of time. That would have been, I guess, the time the Shawnee were. Well, even before then, how early can we say? Is that the earliest we can say that the Shawnee people were in this area in Kentucky? Or
I would put it at about 1000 AD.
Okay.
For certain, that's when the Fort Ancient culture emerges out of the Hopewell and Adena, and so and we've mapped those communities, and they maintain a lot of the characteristics of Shawnee villages. Yeah.
So, and I'm gonna try to put this in my head here, because this is very good stuff, very interesting.
I'm glad to hear that.
I'm adding more books to my long reading book list. So let's say 1000 AD, the Shawnee people are here and so forth, and then DeSoto comes in and kind of ransacks the place and really messes everything up. The Shawnee people, and that's 1500 some, they spread out, and then slowly make their way back to, or how does that go from then, I guess?
Yeah, it's paradoxical, because I need to take one step back in that timeline that you created. Okay. So basically, in the 17th century, there are Virginians who and South Carolinians who are pretty invested in the Native American slave trade. And what they do is they arm Native Americans in their immediate vicinity on the Atlantic coast and encourage them to raid people in the interior. And so slave raiding becomes a real problem, for people in Kentucky, for people in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio. And the reason it's a problem is that the Native Americans along the Atlantic coast are armed. They have guns.
Yeah.
And the folks on the interior don't.
Yeah.
And so what the Shawnee do, which is kind of counterintuitive in a way, but makes sense, is they move toward colonizers.
Yeah.
And basically they strike a devil's bargain with colonizers, and they say, look, if you arm us, we'll supply you with slaves. And so the Shawnees establish this. Well, first they destroy a troublesome community called the Westo, who are affiliated with the British at Augusta, Georgia, and then they literally take possession of their principal village after they destroy them, and they become the kind of dominant group, right
Mm-hmm.
right there at the falls of the fall line of the Savannah River.
Uh-huh.
And they lived that way until roughly 1725 in Maryland, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. But what happens after that is, there's and this is kind of a long rabbit hole that your listeners don't need to go down with me, but around 1715,
Mm-hmm.
the English decide that the African slave trade is preferable to the Native American slave trade,
Mm-hmm.
and so that diminishes in popularity, and then the English become really invested in Native American land, and so there's a lot of dispossession that begins happening
Mm-hmm.
between those former allies, and so Native Americans such as the Shawnee began returning to Ohio and Kentucky roughly 1720.
Gotcha. All right. Well, there you go. That completes my that I understand, and that makes, I mean, it's a lot of points that I don't think people consider or even think about, like how that happens or how they ended up where they were and so forth. But yeah, that paints.
Isn't it
a
isn't
picture.
it fascinating? I mean, you think about, I just think about people and the ways people figure out how to survive.
Yeah.
In the context of their time. I mean, if you're faced with enslavement, is it better to be an enslaver? That's a tough question, and I think about some of the things some of the decisions that Americans make today, that seem contrary to our morals, to our ethics, but we do it, because it's about survival.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to resources,
Right.
the resources, and that that settles. If you look back at many conflicts in history, resources are just about at the top of every one of them.
Yeah.
It's hard to ever really, anything else. Honestly, it's all about resources and who controls those resources, and
that's right.
So forth.
And so the resource that was valuable during the early colonial period was Native Americans themselves.
Yeah.
Their bodies, their labor.
Yeah.
But then when that tapped out circa 1715, then the commodity that was valuable, that became land.
Yeah.
And secondarily, fur-bearing animals.
Mm-hmm.
The deerskin trade was always
beaver
super
trade, all that stuff. Yeah.
But those are, but again, that's about resources, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and even if you go up to a few decades later, you get to the French and Indian War. That was basically, who could control the beaver trade and
right.
so forth. Who and when you sit back and think, you're like, why in the world were they so obsessed with the beavers? But it's a resource.
Because there was a global market.
Yeah, very expensive resource.
I mean, some years from now, people are going to say, why were they so obsessed with oil?
Yeah. Like, well, it's a global market, those who control the oil control the power and all that good stuff.
That's right. That's right.
But yeah. So what you've painted a great picture, or a more understanding picture, and I just don't think people really, think about that, because the other maybe misconception is, during these early stages, Native Americans weren't slaves. The African Americans were the slaves, but that happened pre, and that you explained the reason why it changed. Any other kind of misconceptions that really stick out to you that on your end, there's things that frustrate me on my end that people are like, no, that's just not how it was. But anything else?
Yeah, I think I've been reading a lot of documents from the 1790s, for my own research. And just yesterday, I was reading George Washington's Secretary of War, Henry Knox, explain that that Native Americans are the owners of the land. And Knox and all the Revolutionary Americans went to great lengths to sign treaties with the owners of the land that legally transferred the land, to the United States. And so a big misconception that a lot of people have about Native Americans is that they are a race of people. And what those treaties demonstrate is that Native Americans were and are nations. They were literally treated as foreign powers.
Yeah.
So a treaty between China and the United States today, is the equivalent of a treaty between the United States and the Shawnee. And so in the U.S. Constitution, Native Americans are treated as foreign powers, as nations. And today when folks talk about Native Americans, they seem to have forgotten the fact that they're part of governments.
Yeah.
And that's what distinguishes Native Americans from other racial and ethnic groups. You can't say the same thing about the Latinx population or the African American population, or and so Native Americans are citizens of governments that were once autonomous from the United States.
Yeah. Well, that's very true. I often kind of think of like what was the positive outcome, that what could have happened that would have been more positive, instead of like, because you getting into the Trail of Tears and all those hardships and those kind of terrible things. What could have prevented all that stuff from happening? And I don't have an answer. I don't know if anybody has an answer, but that's kind of like one of the things when I think about, because as you said, these were nations and stuff, and I kind of feel like those founding fathers saw them as nations, but then maybe the next generation of politicians did not have that same feelings, I guess.
Well, and one of the reasons why is power.
Yeah.
I mean, so the reason why Eckert and those guys sell books that are really popular is Native Americans and up through Tecumseh's time posed a real threat to the United States. I mean, militarily they were incredible.
Yeah.
And so in 1791, at St. Clair's defeat, the Native American Alliance killed more than 900 American soldiers. It's the largest defeat of an American military by any Native group. And so that was their context.
Yeah.
And today, people probably think, oh, okay, they're nations, but they're weak.
Yeah.
They think about the military prowess of these nations in the colonial period.
Yeah. Well, and I know, they talk about just how in the native sense, if you added all of them up, they would have outnumbered a lot, as compared to, say, the colonial settlers and so forth, and more came obviously from Europe and other places, but just the number of native or indigenous people that were in America already, was just not even comparable, I guess.
Right.
Dr. Warren, I got to say, this has been very enlightening. I've really enjoyed it. I got a lot of questions, but I don't think we have time to answer them all. As far as the Shawnee in Kentucky, and this is probably not a good question to ask, but would they be the most would they have the biggest claim to Kentucky compared to other tribes, or were they the most influential? In hindsight, we're a bit jaded. I read all these books, all these frontiers books, and they bring up all these tribes.
Yeah.
This tribe was sieged this fort or whatever.
Yeah.
But I see Shawnee the most.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
What do you got on that question?
Well, Kentucky is a very long state. And so, I've driven across it many times. And so it kind of depends on where you're talking about, so Western Kentucky has different, tribal affiliations, than Eastern Kentucky or Southeastern Kentucky versus Southwestern Kentucky. And so you got to put Native communities like the Cherokee in there. You got to talk about the Choctaw and the Chickasaw.
Yeah.
If you're talking about like Northwestern Kentucky, I would include Illinois groups, down there where Kentucky and Illinois converge. So there are, there are many populations with a claim to Kentucky. But I think the reason why the Shawnee dominate the literature so much is because of how hard they fought for the control of the state.
Yeah, gotcha.
And that is distinctive. They lost many people, trying to hold on to Kentucky. And the war was the wars that they fought were incredibly brutal. And so I think that, on both sides, both sides saw no distinction between combatants and non-combatants the way we do now. Women and children were fair game.
Yeah.
People were scalped and murdered. On the flip side of that, Kentuckians tried to starve Native Americans. So one of their main tactics was burning.
Yeah, whole villages.
And so, this was a really brutal and prolonged war. A lot of folks think like that it was pretty quick, but it really wasn't. When you stop and think about it, I mean, we're talking about like from the 1770s, through the 1790s. More than 20 years. People, fighting and dying for this land.
Yeah. And even if you begin to think of the War of 1812, which
right.
not as many battles in Kentucky as that, but if you throw that in there, you're looking at a 40-year war almost.
Yeah, which in a historian's terms is 2 generations.
Wow.
So think about that.
Yeah.
This was far from a quick and decisive thing.
Yeah.
This was a prolonged genocidal conflict.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes their history popular, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, not the reasons you want your history to be popular,
No.
I guess.
No.
Well, Dr. Warren, I think that's a good stopping point to kind of wrap it up. How can people get a hold of you? Your books? How can they get a hold of your books and that sort of stuff? If you want to plug that real quick.
I'm pretty Googleable on on Amazon, and I do have an email address through UIowa. Please, feel free to. I can't promise a response, but I'll try. Don't hesitate to reach out. And Jameson, I just want to give you a shout out, for being an elementary school teacher and being curious about your state's history. Your students are lucky to have you.
Oh, well, thank you. As long as they stay awake is all I can.
Well, that's every teacher's first goal.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you again for coming on. And next book comes out, or maybe even we go in depth in some more of these other books. You are welcome to come back on and talk some more Shawnee history or any other history as far as that goes. So
that sounds great.
Thanks again for joining us, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.